I'm excited to welcome you all to the Committee on Oversight Reform's roundtable on tackling peak pollution, achieving environmental justice for frontline communities. Today's panel is at the Variety Boys and Girls Club of Queens in New York City. We are also live streaming this conversation for the public, and committee members have been invited to participate, and some panelists virtually. I want to thank the Boys and Girls Club and Director Costa Constantinides for inviting us, for hosting us, and for being such an outstanding environmental leader in his own right. We are here today because people in New York City and across our country are dying. It's being reported that over 3,000 New Yorkers lose their lives from health conditions related to particulate matter pollution, and our city's peaker power plants are chiefly responsible. Peakers are the dirtiest and most dangerous smokestacks used at peak times of energy demands, like today where we're over 90 degrees in heat in New York City, and they are largely concentrated in low-income communities. For the 1.2 million New Yorkers living within 1 mile of a peaker, rates of asthma and death from COVID-19 and from other illnesses are severely elevated. In addition to the noxious fumes from peaker plants, these residents are exposed to constant pollution from large power plants that run all the time and chronic congestion. Convening with communities on the ground to address issues like this one is central to the Oversight Committee's environmental justice agenda. That's why this morning at Queensbridge Park, I met with residents of New York City's so-called Asthma Alley to discuss the issues they face and the solutions they need. The most moving testimony for me came from Mrs. Cougar, who has lived in our community for 60 years. She said she came here and the air was clean, but then they built the peaker plants, and now her grandchildren and her children have to have breathing machines because they suffer from asthma. It is plain wrong to put so many polluting peaker plants in one area. There are 10 peaker plants within 1 mile of where we are sitting today, and 28 within the vicinity of the district that I represent in Queens. And there's a hearing later on today because they want to add yet another peaker plant in Ocasio-Cortez's district. This is plain wrong. It's life-threatening. It's killing people, and we have to stop it. And this is not an isolated problem. It's a problem in Manhattan, in the Bronx, in Brooklyn. There's a whopping 89 peaker units in New York City alone. As we discussed this morning, we must pursue innovative alternatives at every level of government. This begins with community-driven solutions, which we're listening to today, ideas from the community up. We've had enough of the top telling us we need these peaker plants. We don't need them. We want to stop them. And that is what the Peak Coalition's proposal is, which I am supporting, to eliminate half of the city's 89 peakers by 2025, and all of them by 2030. We have the technology to achieve this. We just need the political will to make it happen. I wholeheartedly support this transformative undertaking and look forward to discussing other grassroots ideas as well, like building community solar in Sunset Park, or converting an inhumane jail and toxic waste site into an environmental justice hub through renewable Rikers. At the federal level, we need to enact HR 2021, Environmental Justice for All Act, led by Chair of the National Resources Committee, Raul Grijalva. This bill would require agencies to consider the cumulative impacts of pollution in permitting decisions. If his bill had passed, there is no way that the peaker plant they're trying to build in her district would ever be built. What the law says now is you look at the impact of one peaker plant. So they look at one peaker plant, they think it's all right, but they're not looking at the other 89 peaker plants that are contributing to the air. 28, 10 within 1 mile of my district. It's awful. We have to pass this bill that he is proposing. We also need to pass HR 3139, the Peaker Act, which was authored by our colleague, Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, who joined us at the community discussion prior to today, to this meeting. And this would be a tax incentive and grant program to help retire peaker plants in historically marginalized communities. Additionally, as part of the Oversight Committee's environmental justice agenda, we're developing legislation to minimize the strain placed on the electric grid that leads to the use of peakers, including by setting a 100% renewable energy target for the federal government. We also know that data is key to good policy making. So we want to deploy air quality sensors on federal buildings and vehicles so that we can tell when communities are in danger in real time. Beyond these legislative ideas, I strongly support the Biden administration's whole of government approach to environmental justice through the Justice 40 initiative. I am determined to conduct strong oversight of its implementation. We must get this right and ensure that every federal agency has the tools it needs to direct at least 40% of the benefits of infrastructure investments to frontline communities like the ones that we are in now that is over polluted. The community leaders at the table today are engaging with utilities and public regulators to address decades of environmental racism, working with frontline families to retrofit homes and reduce strain on the grid, empowering public housing residents to drive their own solutions, and identifying clean energy alternatives for communities across the country impacted by the polluting peakers. If we follow their lead, my constituents in the Queensbridge, Ravenswood, and Astoria houses will finally breathe a little easier. Finally, there are over 1,000 peakers across the country. Every impacted community needs a peak coalition fighting on their behalf for rapid change. There can be no more sacrifice zones where people are dying. I hope today's roundtable will not only advance change in our community, but will encourage my congressional colleagues to support the legislative solutions that we will be discussing today. I am thrilled to be joined by a panel today. We will hear from Anel Hernandez, Associate Director of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance and coordinator of our Peak Coalition. Also to speak for the Peak Coalition is Anthony Carafe Rogers Wright, Director of Environmental Justice for New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. We welcome Calvin Thompson, Finance and Special Initiatives Associate for Block Power, who's with us virtually. We're also honored to have Ilana Duverge, the co-founder and director of the Movement School. And last but not least, it's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Elena Krager, who has flown from California here to be with us today, the Director of Research for the respected Research and Policy Institute, known as Research, Physicians, Scientists, and Engineers for Healthy Energy. I want to thank our remarkable panel. I also want to thank my friend and roundtable co-lead, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. She has fought fearlessly to stop an expansion of peakers in her own district, which is pollution overburden. And the solutions she champions, like the Green New Deal and the Green New Deal for public housing, are essential to empowering environmental justice communities. At this time, I want to welcome Mr. Norman, the ranking member of our environmental subcommittee. Thank you so much, Ralph, Norman, for joining us. You will be recognized for 5 minutes, and then we'll be followed by Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez. Thank you for joining us, Ralph, Norman. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chairwoman Maloney. Let me say from the outset, we're here today. We're talking about peak solutions for environmental justice, for environmental racism, for those who suffer from the environment in different places all over the country. What's being left out is the conditions that we're facing in Afghanistan, the people that are going to be slaughtered because they cannot get out by the 31st. The Intel meeting where military people said, we can't do it, please give us more time. These people will never get to enjoy the environment. These people will never get to enjoy the freedoms that we have here. So I'm just, while I thank the panelists, I think it's atrocious that we're not paying attention to and putting that we all aren't putting pressure on the Biden administration to do what's right for our allies and our friends around the country. It's not happening, and it's a sad day in this country. Today, the majority is hosting this event, which follows both an Environmental Full Justice Committee hearing and subcommittee hearing. As I said during those hearings, I fear that policies being proposed by the Biden administration and the radical left, like the American Jobs Plan and the Green New Deal, will make living conditions more difficult, particularly for low-income communities. These overambitious and exorbitant policies, which can be only made possible through raising our debt ceiling to extreme levels, will ruin our economy and do away with affordable energy while destroying millions of jobs. This means that economically disadvantaged communities will no longer have access to the type of cheap, reliable energy that enables economic growth. The United States has made great strides when it comes to emissions. The most recent US EPA annual air quality report shows that we are leading the world in reducing emissions, having reduced more than the next 12 emissions reducing countries combined. However, under this administration, the cost of gas, which is being bought from countries that don't like us, and consumer goods has skyrocketed. How is that working out for the middle and the poor? According to a recently released report by AAA, the average price of gas nationwide has climbed to $3.14, a 40% increase since January 1. The increase in gas prices alone, not counting food, supplies, and other costs, is costing American consumers billions of dollars. Where is the sympathy for these people? This is not the American energy dominance that we saw from the prior 4 years. It's just one of the many factors driving up consumer prices, also referred to as inflation in this flailing Biden economy. The Biden administration and congressional Democrats' out of control spending is causing inflation to skyrocket. As a result, Americans are now paying more for goods and services while taking home less money in their paychecks. And this will only get worse in the upcoming reconciliation packages if it passes. Instead of examining ways to strengthen our economy, stop the Biden border crisis, and even hold a hearing on the devastating situation now unfolding in Afghanistan, Democrats want to continue spending billions of dollars on government projects and progressive pipe dreams. If Democrats truly want to address the needs of economically disadvantaged communities, they should be looking for solutions to encourage investment from the private sector instead of massive tax increases to support policies that only have negligible climate impacts. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank each one of the participants for their involvement today.
Thank you so much for participating with us. I join you in saying that the situation in Afghanistan is heartbreaking. And as chair of the Oversight Committee, I intend to do everything in my power to protect American citizens and the U.S. homeland, and to ensure the human rights of all Afghans, that they are protected. The administration is laser focused on getting U.S. citizens and our allies, our Afghan allies, out of the country, while ensuring the safety of our service members and our diplomatic corps. In fact, as of today, more than 101 Americans and Afghan allies have been evacuated. The committee is watching the situation closely, and we are working with Ranking Members Comer and Grothman to brief members, hopefully next week, on the developments. But now is not the time to be assigning blame. We need to get every American and Afghan ally out. This war has spanned 20 years, 2 Republican presidents, 2 Democratic presidents. There'll be opportunities for taking this up later in a committee meeting, but we have planned this hearing. We have brought experts in to discuss it. We have planned this hearing for 2 months. We would like to focus on the issue before us. But I just have to respond to your attacks on the economy. Since President Biden took office, Democrats have advanced policies that have grown the economy by 4 million documented jobs. In fact, the economy has grown its fastest rate in nearly 40 years. So that's another conversation. So I look forward to that conversation, but we have important people here who have worked hard on their testimonies, and they have worked hard on their presentations. I'd like to proceed to that. I would now like to recognize my friend and colleague, Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Maloney, for hosting this very important hearing. And thank you to all of our attendees and our witnesses for joining us here today. I think one of the things that was just kind of brought up was this idea that, that Americans need, quote unquote, this idea that we have had cheap energy. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about this myth of quote unquote cheap energy. Because right now in Astoria, in the district that I represent, in frontline communities, in low income communities, in Black communities, in Latino communities, in immigrant communities, in brown communities, indigenous communities, we know that there is no such thing as cheap energy. Because the price of cheap energy has always been our lives, our health, our lungs, our cancer rates. So maybe it's cheap for someone else in a mansion that gets to breathe clean air in a nice property, but it is not cheap for the 1.2 million people in this city alone that live within striking distance of a peaker plant. We have right here in our district and in our city. And by the way, let's also talk about the fact that the economics of a peaker plant are not cheaper either. Electricity from peaker plants in New York City alone are up to 1,300% more expensive than the average cost of electricity in the rest of this state alone, let alone the rest of the country. But when you look at the proposed retirement and replacement plans for a peaker plant, people could save, ratepayers could save $1 billion in energy costs by 2035 by replacing these plants alone. And the reduced environmental and health impacts from the avoided emissions from a peaker plant could create an additional savings of another $1 billion by 2035, not nationwide, right here at home in our city. This myth of cheap energy, especially when we talk about the tragedy and the travesty of what is happening in Afghanistan right now, the amount of global conflict, the amount of lives that are given up, both in our health, both in global conflict, both in geopolitical destabilization. Oil is anything but cheap. It is the most costly fuel source that we have, with the ultimate cost being our planet and our future. So let's dispense with the myth that gas and oil and fossil fuels are cheap. They are the most costly thing that we do. And future generations do not have the opportunity here to tell us what this is costing them. So I want to start off with that note. Now, right here, let's talk about the brass tacks and the facts. According to the New York Public Service Commission, peaker plants around the city emit twice as much carbon dioxide per unit of electricity than regular power plants, and 20 times as much as nitrogen oxides. And before I go further, I want us to step back a little bit in defining the peaker plant issue as well. What are peaker plants? You know, I apologize for just diving into this. What is a peaker plant for folks following at home? During the summer and during other periods of intense power needs, when everyone, especially during a heat wave, and this situation will get worse as climate change bears on, we all need to keep cool, both for our safety, for our comfort, etc. So if you have everyone in New York City all of a sudden starting to turn on an air conditioner, for example, or across the country during a heat wave, if everyone's turning on an air conditioner, that creates a sudden load into our power systems, sudden demand. That goes and elevates beyond the average power use in a community. So what do we do? Well, for a very long time in many communities, they have decided to install what is known as peaker plants, temporary fossil fuel plants that turn on just for these times of intense energy use. And then for the rest of the time, throughout the rest of the year, they lay dormant. Fossil fuel companies and multimillionaires and billionaires, frankly, rake in because they get paid regardless. They get paid billions of dollars, about 4.5 billion just here in New York City alone, just to have the option of switching on a peaker plant. And so the argument here from the fossil fuel industry is that there is no other way. There is no other way we can solve this problem. We cannot solve or address the intensity of power demand in any other way. That there's no way that solar can do it. There's no way that any other source of renewable or clean energy can do it. That there's no way that we can address technology. There's no way we can use battery storage. And our answer to that is simply, it is not true. It's not true. We believe and we know that there is a better way. Our witnesses and our experts that are testifying here today know and understand the details of how we can do that better way. We can hear about battery storage. We can hear about community solar. We can hear about microgrids. We can hear about expanded opportunities for how we can save our planet and our city if we just loosen the grip of dark money and the fossil fuel lobby over people, loosen that grip over those in positions like mine. So that's what we're here to listen about today. And particularly in this community, in March, NRG planned to convert the Astoria peaker plants from oil burning into a natural gas facility. That's also not the way. And when we talk about reducing carbon emissions, there's a lot of funny math that goes into this from the fossil fuel industry. They want you to believe that fracking brings down carbon emissions. What they don't tell you is that it skyrockets methane emissions, which are up to 68 times more concentrated and powerful than CO2 emissions in trapping heat in our atmosphere, in our environment. So let's cut the jokes, let's cut the funny math, let's cut the tricks, and let's actually discuss how we truly solve our problem instead of using methane and carbon and really just using all of these euphemisms to save and coddle the fossil fuel industry. We need to talk about just transitions. We need to talk about how we're going to support fossil fuel workers in this transition. We need to talk about how we're going to center and repair the damage done in frontline communities in the name of quote unquote cheap gas. And we need to make sure how we chart a positive and hopeful and optimistic path for our future, because we're living with this regardless. We can either choose to suffer more, or we can choose to come together and change the path of our future. And that's why we're here today. So again, I'd like to thank our witnesses. I'd like to thank our chairwoman for hosting us today, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. And I thank her because she is the co-lead for this roundtable. I thank her for her statement and her work. Now let's turn to the panelists. They each have 3 minutes to introduce themselves and their work before we get to the questions and answers. Mrs. Hernandez, why don't we start with you?
Great. Thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Anel Hernandez, and I'm with the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. We are an alliance of 11 community-based organizations across New York City, representing different EJ communities, communities of color, in their struggle against environmental burdens and environmental racism. In New York City, we have various peaker plants sited across the city, disproportionately sited in EJ communities. These facilities, as we referenced, are old, inefficient, costly, and dirty. And they are sited in communities that are already dealing with other polluting infrastructure in their community. So they're dealing with cumulative burdens. It's not just these peakers, but it's highways, it's waste transfer facilities, it's other polluting and industrial facilities sited in these areas. As Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez alluded to, these peaker plants are turned on during peak demand. That means that when we have a heat wave, they are turned on, making air quality in these same communities that much worse. And climate change projections show that the number of 90-degree days is projected to double, and that heat waves are projected to either triple or quadruple, which means that we need to make sure that we're building a renewable, resilient energy system to withstand those changes. Again, it is important to consider that ratepayers, all of us that are paying our utility bills, we are paying for these peaker plants to have them on hold. Over the last 10 years, we paid $4.5 billion just to have them on call. Imagine the type of clean and renewable energy projects that we could have invested in with that same $4.5 million. In New York, we now have the CLCPA, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which already sets a very clear mandate for New York that we need to have a zero emission electricity sector by 2040. And that means that we need to start acting now in order to meet that deadline and hopefully even exceed that deadline. We also have other regulations that have made sure that we lower the amount of NOx and other co-pollutants coming from these facilities. And this is the reason that the plant in this community, NRG, the Astoria Repowering Project, is being forced to close their facility because it's so polluting and harmful to the community. And yet they come back with a proposal to build a new natural gas facility, and then at that 2040 timeline, transition to fall solutions, to green hydrogen. Recent research from Bob Howarth and Mark Jacobson show that green hydrogen and blue hydrogen have the potential to have even higher emission profiles than natural gas facilities. So we need to make sure that we're not wasting our money in these fall solutions, that we are focusing on renewables, on large scale solar, on community owned solar, on battery energy storage systems, offshore wind, microgrids. We need to focus on those solutions. One of those key solutions, as was mentioned earlier by Congresswoman Maloney, is renewable Rikers. With renewable Rikers partners and also Councilmember Constantinides, who's here today, we passed a transformative bill to shut down a notorious jail facility in New York City and use that land, over 400 acres of land, to build the renewable energy that we need. We see that as a model of what just transition can mean in New York City. We need a decentralized approach that creates more resilient power systems. We need to modernize our power grid. We cannot keep paying for this inefficient, old, dirty, health impacting peaker plants. In addition, all of this also provides a lot of job opportunities. It is really the core of the just transition. Us at the Peak Coalition, we've also partnered with the New York Power Authority to conduct research to better understand how we can transition, how we can do it equitably, how we can create co-benefits, jobs, and new opportunities for our communities. So thank you so much, and I look forward to partnering with everyone in this room to make it happen.
Thank you. Next is Mr. Rogers White. You are now recognized.
Thank you so much, Madam Chairwoman, and always good to be joined by our friend and a sister in struggle for climate justice, Representative Ocasio-Cortez. Thank you for your continued leadership on Green New Deal and environmental justice for the whole. My name is Anthony Karifa Rogers Wright. I use him, his pronouns, and I'm the Director of Environmental Justice with New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. Since 1976, we have been standing and fighting with New Yorkers to increase civil rights, social justice, and environmental justice. We believe in community lawyering, and such that we are putting communities first and foremost. Our motto, justice through community power, guides us. But here we're also today, I'm here to talk about how communities are powered. So before I do that, I think it's very important to just take a brief history lesson into how we got to this point of environmental justice. Back in 1982, the great Benjamin Chavez, who coined the term environmental racism, described it as racial discrimination in environmental policymaking, the enforcement of regulation and laws, the deliberate targeting of communities of color for toxic waste facilities, the official sanctioning of life-threatening presence of poisons and pollutants in our communities, and the history of excluding people of color from leadership and ecology movements. I would have to say that peaker plants, which we are here to talk about shutting down and replacing with renewable forms of energy, represent the epitome of environmental racism. I would like to point out that our good friends and amazing organization, As We Sow, who are stakeholder advocates for advocates of clean energy investments, recently ranked NRG, which is, as our good friend Anel just spoke about, planning to continue the life or extend the life of a dirty peaker plant in Astoria. They've received a grade, according to As You Sow, of negative 44% when it comes to environmental justice. That means that there is a deficit of justice. Somehow they got lower than zero, less than zero. We're going back to the 80s here with scores like that. Now, we have to shift, as Representative Ocasio-Cortez pointed out, from this idea of it pays to pollute. In our report with the Peak Coalition that we released in 2020, it was revealed that over the last decade, $4.5 billion of the people's money went to the owners of these peaker plants just in case they were going to be turned on. We have to flip the script on that. That is absolutely execrable, and we are essentially saying that it is letting people profit off of turning Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian, and even poor white communities into energy sacrifice zones. What we do know is that Black, Brown, and Indigenous and Asian people are breathing in toxic air that has been generated disproportionately by affluent white people, and as Representative Ocasio-Cortez stated, we have to change that. Now, I know that my time is running out, so I do want to also lift up, as the chairwoman did, HR 2021, the Environmental Justice for All Act, which of course was introduced by our good friends, Chairman Raul Grijalva of Arizona and our good friend Donna the Kitchen of Virginia. It is very, very important that as we are doing this just transition away from fossil fuels and to a renewable energy and regenerative economies, that we absolutely do not pass any infrastructure package that would reduce the power of the National Environmental Policy Act. We have to be very, very careful of that. And the reason why I say that is that even when we are evaluating potential renewable energy projects, we must make sure that they do not disproportionately impact Black, Brown, Indigenous, and environmental justice communities. So that's a message that has to be very, very clear. And one thing that I will say is that frontline communities cannot be treated as theoretical variables. They must be immediately identified as called for in the legislation that was championed by our good friend, Representative Corey Bush, and our very good friend, who of course co-sponsored the Green New Deal legislation with Representative Ocasio-Cortez, Ed Markey from Massachusetts. Once we identify these communities, we will have a much better opportunity to lift up the Justice 40 proposal by the President of the United States that comes from the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and make sure that those communities are centered and lifted up. I will finally leave you by saying this. For all this talk about worry on increased prices and the loss of jobs, one thing that we could ask in the spirit of bipartisanship, both sides to do, come together, pass the PRO Act, HR 1, allow workers easier ability to organize and unionize, and put 40% of them on corporate boards, and end the corrupting influence of dirty and dark money. Thank you so much for this opportunity, Chairwoman, Representative Ocasio-Cortez. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Next we'll hear from Ilana Javert. You are now recognized, Ilana.
Thank you so much. Members of the Congressional Oversight Committee, thank you so much for convening this space to discuss such a critical and time-sensitive issue plaguing our communities of color. My name is Ilona DeVerge. My pronouns are she, her, ella, and I'm the co-founder and director of Movement School. In my capacity, I have helped cultivate leaders and organizers to fight on behalf of their working class communities by providing tools and resources to advocate for justice, achieve innovative, locally driven solutions to key issues, and mobilize grassroots engagement in the democratic process. Through this work, we have developed various training programs, including Reclaim. Reclaim is a specialized leadership development program for public housing tenants that combines the powerful tools of organizing with real-world solutions to combat public housing's deleterious conditions and uncertain future. The program centers and elevates the voices of public housing residents, creates space for coalition building to catalyze systemic change, and proposes innovative community solutions to tackle issues from the racial wealth gap to the climate crisis. Piloting this bottom-up approach and truly allowing those closest to the pain to have a seat at the table led to the creation of the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act, introduced by Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Bernie Sanders. The fellows participated in a drafting process that centered their needs and the vision for the future of public housing. Since then, Movement School and the Sunrise Movement had collaborated to grow the impact of the work of these public housing tenants to meet the urgency and the scale of the crisis by launching cohorts across the country in key areas like Los Angeles, Miami, New Orleans, San Juan, and of course, New York City, to continue organizing around the Green New Deal for public housing. It's an honor to engage in this discussion today and speak about why investing in public housing, especially in New York City, should be the alternative to powering the city in times of need, instead of continuing to poison the air and the water of low-income communities of color by moving forward with this proposed peaker plant. And this is because the Green New Deal for public housing is so much more than just repairs. It is the intersection of health, housing, and the potential for a livable future. Investing in public housing is investing in the broader community. It's not only focused on the externalities caused by the proposed racist, classist, and obsolete solutions, but addresses the root of these systemic issues. It is a complete transition away from an economy ran by the fossil fuel industry to an economy stimulated by the clean energy industry that will create millions of high-paying jobs and reduce our energy costs. Lastly, it's rooted in racial and economic justice by ensuring that the communities most impacted are prioritized and benefit from this transition. I hope this discussion today can bring us one step closer to achieving justice, equity, and a livable future for our most vulnerable communities impacted by these people plans in the broader climate crisis. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. And Dr. Krieger, you're now recognized. Dr. Krieger.
Chairwoman Maloney, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, and the rest of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I am the Director of Research at Physicians, Scientists, and Engineers for Healthy Energy. We are an energy science and policy nonprofit research institute, originally founded here in New York and currently based out of Oakland, California. At PSC, we study the health, environment, and equity dimensions of energy production and use. I originally focused my mechanical and aerospace engineering PhD research on energy storage for renewable energy systems. And when I arrived at PSC in 2013, I began with a big question. How do we adopt energy storage in such a way that achieves the greatest societal benefits, including addressing climate change, the environment, human health, equity, and resilience? I began by analyzing electricity generation in California, and two themes emerged. My first key finding was that our state's peaker power plants, which run a small fraction of time to meet peak electricity demand, jumped out as prime candidates for replacement with energy storage based on operational, environmental health, and demographic measures. The second major finding is that some of the greatest co-benefits come from not just replacing these plants with energy storage and clean electricity resources, but that distributing batteries, efficiency, and other resources throughout the community will provide additional resilience and economic benefits. Peakers are prime for replacement, in part because they're some of the most expensive resources on the grid, as we have heard, and because they often run for only a few hours at a time, making energy storage a good technological match. Far beyond that, however, in states like California and New York, we found that these plants have the highest rate of health-damaging air pollutant emissions per unit of electricity generated, meaning that you get the biggest bang for your buck for every megawatt hour of clean generation displacing cheap generation. They are often all simultaneously fired up on hot summer days with already poor air quality, like today. In California, south of San Joaquin Valley, we found that 2/3 of generation from some of these plants on days exceeding federal ozone and particulate matter standards. In California, we also found that half the state's plants are located in our 25% most disadvantaged communities who face high cumulative socioeconomic, health, and environmental burdens, meaning that this pollution is disproportionately impacting our most vulnerable populations. In New York, 80% of the state's peakers are over 30 years old, many over 50. 40% primarily burn oil, which has higher emission rates than gas-burning peakers, and 1/3 are located in areas designated as environmental justice communities because they have high concentrations of low-income households and populations of color. Beyond that, we actually calculated the cumulative environmental, health, and socioeconomic burdens on populations in these plants, and some of those in the Bronx, those in Astoria, jumped out as having the highest cumulative socioeconomic burdens in the state. New York City also has some of the country's most urban power plants, meaning many more people are breathing in pollutants released from their stacks than elsewhere. I have found similar themes in the 9 states whose speakers I've analyzed in detail. We're now at a turning point, however, where we can begin by replacing the more than 1,000 oil and gas-fired peaker plants across the country. Lithium-ion battery prices have plummeted 90% in the last 10 years and are now cost competitive in replacing peakers in numerous places. At the same time, the state and federal government are rapidly expanding clean energy resources to meet climate targets. If we focus some of these efforts on displacing plants with high emission rates, plants in urban areas, and those in our most vulnerable communities, we can simultaneously reduce pollutant emissions while investing in these communities to provide resilience and cost savings to those who need it most, setting a precedent for how we can equitably transition our entire power sector.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We'll now recognize Mr. Thompson. He's speaking to us virtually. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present, Chairwoman Maloney and Representative Ocasio-Cortez. My name is Calvin Thompson. I'm the Director of Special Initiatives at Block Power, and we are a clean energy tech company that is primarily focused on decarbonizing LMI communities around New York, as well as the larger country. So we have done over 1,000 decarbonization projects across the city of New York, primarily located in low-income communities of color. We are a Black-owned company, and our mission is really devoted to cleaning up these communities where we grew up and providing opportunity for folks who have been historically excluded and harmed by the policy and practices that have endured to date. And we really believe that there's a tremendous opportunity for job creation, for wealth creation, and for improving the health outcomes of communities of color simultaneously. And so at Block Power, we have created things like no money down lease offerings for heat pump technologies so that low-income consumers, regardless of their credit history, can get access to clean technology that will improve their air quality, that will improve the energy load, and save them money. And we see these types of projects as exactly the things that will support transitioning away from peaker plants and providing healthier communities. by reducing the overall energy load by 20 to 70% when we do these projects, we can create a ripple effect that in mass, when we talk about the million buildings across New York City, can have a tremendous impact on the baseline need for peaker plants in the first place. And secondarily, when we talk about community power generation, we're actually partnering on that Sunset Solar Park project that you mentioned, Chairwoman Maloney. And we see these as exactly the type of collaborative efforts that can lead to not only healthier communities, but job creation in the long term. So we want to turn the residents of Sunset Park into owners of this community facility. We want them to not only save money, but to see economic dividends in the long term from participating in the green revolution. And we see these opportunities across the board. We're doing a large workforce project now through the city of New York in low-income communities like Mott Haven, Brownsville, and South Jamaica, Queens. We are bringing young people at risk of gun violence into the fold of green construction work, training them and employing them on block power projects, doing everything from air quality assessments to energy auditing of old buildings. And all of these are examples of ways where it can involve communities, save them money, give them opportunity to learn new trades and enter high income careers over the long term, and clean up our grid and rely less on fossil fuel while generating clean energy locally. So I'll pause there, and I'm very excited for your questions. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you to all of the panelists. And we're going to now start a round of questions with 3 minutes allotted per member. Once we get through one round, we'll open up the discussion for a more informal dialogue. I'd like to kick it off by asking Mrs. Hernandez, I'd love to start with you. The Peak Coalition's agreement with the New York Power Authority is a transformational agreement. I understand you may be limited in what you can share with us today about your internal discussions, but can you tell us a bit about the progress you have made over the past 20 years in getting NYPA to finally engage with the community? Ms. Hernandez.
Yep. I'm just gonna make this a little bit more central so you can see.
Ms. Hernandez.
Oh, yeah, she just needs this. Well.
Oh, great. So as many of you know, 20 years ago, the New York Power Authority cited new peaker plants in New York City, saying that they were temporary. And yet 20 years later, as you well know, we have all of these plants still running, still operating. So we wanted to start a conversation with the New York Power Authority, especially on the heels of the CLCPA, to see how we can address this issue. They understood that it was a problem, that it disproportionately impacts EJ communities, and they were willing to start a research partnership with us so that we can begin to explore the solutions, how we begin to transition away from these peaker plants. And they have also announced their own commitment to phase out the peakers by 2030. They call it Vision 2030. So we are excited, and we hope that the New York Power Authority, as a public agency, as a public authority, can really demonstrate the path forward and take the lead in the transition so that others can follow.
Thank you. The progress that you've achieved is an enormous success and one that should be duplicated across the city, our state, and the country. Congratulations. It's never too late to address these wrongs. Mr. Rogers Wright, the wave of peakers by NYPA installed in 2001 were so dirty. They were supposed to operate 3 years and then be replaced, but that never happened. Today's landmark climate law, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and emissions caps should be preventing new fossil fuel plants, but we have a hearing later on. They're trying to jam another one in. And yet the state's patchwork of regulations mean that more plants still can slip in and be built here and all over the downstate region. So my question is, why are new peakers still being considered in communities that are already overburdened with pollution? And what can the federal government do to stop it?
Thank you so much for that question, Madam Chairwoman. What I will say is that New York Lawyers for Public Interest, in partnership with New York City Environmental Justice Alliance and our friends at Earth Justice, have determined that peaker plants would not align with the requirements of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. So one way or another, they will get shut down by 2040. So it's a bad investment, and it's bad to double and triple down on them. Now, in terms of what the federal government can do, earlier today, we were joined by your colleague, Representative Yvette Clark, proud Brooklynite as well. No shade on the Bronx, Senator Ocasio-Cortez, and her piece of legislation with Senator Gillibrand that would eventually kill these peaker plants and shut them down. So we are very, very proud of the leadership, climate leadership that we continue to see coming out of New York State. And then also, even at the state level, where our good friend Senator Jabari Brisport, in his first term as a state senator, also introduced legislation that would end peaker plants and call for them to shut down in the next 5 years. So we do have the legislation. We have to get it on the floor, perhaps get it included to the best of our ability in the reconciliation package, and eventually get this signed into law by the president, who of course is very committed to environmental and climate justice.
Thank you. While some states have made progress, the federal government really ran away from their responsibility in too many areas for enforcement. And I agree completely with the National Resources Chairman Rahava that the cumulative impacts suffered by communities must be included in the Clean Air Act and the Water Act permitting decisions. Now what they do is they look at one polluting peaker plant. They say, oh, it's safe, but they're not looking at the overall pollution, the cumulative effect. And we have to change that. It's a must. I'd like to now turn to our colleague, Mr. Norman. You're now recognized, Congressman Norman. Let's see what this.
Let's do, it's not on, he's not on, we can move into.
But he's talking, I can hear him.
Oh, he must be on mute.
He's talking, but I can hear him. Mr. Norman, can you speak louder? He's not on. Okay, there seems to be some technical difficulties. We're now going to Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez as co-lead of this event. You're now recognized.
Thank you. Actually, I'll keep my mask on here. You know, I think one of the things that it's important for us to address is that once we have these once we start having these conversations, spokespeople, you know, PR folks from fossil fuel companies and other sorts of energy companies come in saying, we're the adults in the room, we understand these technologies, and it's simply not possible. So one such instance that we've seen right here is that, and I'd like to ask Mr. Anthony Rogers Wright, the energy spokesperson, David Schrader, recently wrote in an email to the committee that, quote, no combination of renewable technologies available today can by themselves reliably power Queens, let alone New York City. Now, we know that there's a lot that goes into a response here, and I just want to kind of yield the floor to you and say, what do you say to folks that say this is just with the technology and the systems that we have today, this is technologically and infrastructure-wise impossible?
Thank you for that question, Congresswoman. I will say that, you know, like medicine, the technology for renewable energy is just in leaps and bounds to where we are today. We know that we're going to have very, very shortly the battery storage capacity for, you know, the myopic response here, what happens on cloudy days. We have that technology, we are nearly there. So, and if we can unleash community solar, as Mr. Hernandez spoke about earlier, places like Sunset Park, Brooklyn, where the poorest neighborhoods in the city, okay, we can also do this. We can do this in the Bronx. So, I would take umbrage with that statement, And I think that we have to equate that as, the standard rhetoric that we hear from proponents of the fossil fuel industry. And we know that this culture of fear is something that is utilized to stop or otherwise obfuscate the just transition. The fossil fuel industry is doubling and tripling down because the time is coming to an end. Okay, here in New York, we have banned fracking. We have to ban fracking infrastructure. We know that as well. But the technology is there. It's just about the political will, and that's why we look to leaders like yourself and Chairwoman Maloney to help deliver this just transition, to help lead this just transition, and base it on science. And we also know that the fossil fuel industry, science is an anathema for them. And so I would say that again, we have to just move past feckless and myopic statements like that and stick to the facts.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is Mr. Norman, is he available now? Mr. Norman? Mr. Norman? Then let's go to Grothman, Mr. Grothman. On the Republican side, are you available? Mr. Grothman? Okay, we're now going to Mr. Lynch, Congressman Lynch from Massachusetts. Mr. Lynch.
Sorry.
Is that Grothman? Okay, Mr. Grothman is recognized on the Republican side.
I'd just like to thank you for having it. I'd like to thank you for having an active committee. Eventually, I'd like to have another hearing on the COVID or Afghanistan, but I'll let us move on in the interest of time.
Okay, Mr. Lynch, you're now recognized, Mr. Lynch. Thank you. Mr. Cooper, you're now recognized. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Welsh, you're now recognized. Mr. Welsh.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate both you and my colleague, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, but I really especially appreciate the witnesses from the community. What I hear you saying is very direct and very simple. You want clean power, you want good jobs, and you want good health. That's really what it's about. In Washington, the fossil fuel industry does have a powerful grip on public policy. Just as an example, in a 10-year period, the oil companies made $1 trillion in profits. But you know what? We continued in Washington to provide them with tax breaks. $1 trillion is pretty good income, and you don't need to supplement it with taxpayer tax breaks. My colleague, Congressman Ocasio-Cortez, spoke about the myth of cheap energy, and we know what that is. Essentially, those owners get the profits, and those communities get the health effects. They get the loss of money and reinvestment in their own community. There's a second myth that I want to ask a few questions about, and that is the myth that there's no alternative to fossil fuels, and that if we try to make a transition, it's going to cost jobs and weaken the economy. Mr. Thompson, I heard your testimony to essentially challenge that. If I understood you correctly, you say, A, it is possible, and B, it can improve the economy. Could you elaborate on that? Because I think that is the central argument that we have to make about the economic opportunity of facing this challenge rather than denying the challenge. Mr. Thompson.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Congressman Welsh. I think if we put it in the context of the long term, it's the most helpful view. We're talking about the precipice of a significant climate awakening on a global scale. I think anyone who read the IPCC report last week or the week before would understand that we're headed for dramatic impacts no matter what we do. And yet we have an opportunity to stave off the worst. And I think that's really critical. So when the president and Senator Schumer talk about a civilian climate corps like we had, after the New Deal in the 30s, that is the type of 400 to 500,000 person job initiative that we're talking about to meet the scale of this crisis. I think there's a near-term opportunity in the next 5 years to create 400,000 to 500,000 plus jobs that are clean energy jobs, paying really strong competitive wages. And over the 10-year term, we're talking millions of jobs. And in New York City specifically, we've created thousands of jobs across our 1,000 plus projects, cleaning up buildings, implementing solar and other clean energy technologies. And this is exactly the type of thing that we can replicate while lowering violence in our communities as well. And I think when we talk in a holistic sense, it's really an issue of redlining taken into the 21st century. And there's an opportunity to reverse that by investing in incentives for clean energy programs, by investing in job initiatives, by investing in just communications and outreach to communities that may not be aware of what exists already. And these are the types of things that we want to collaborate with utilities, communities, and politicians on to bring to the fore.
Thank you very much. It's very powerful. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Representative Johnson. You're now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for hosting this hearing along with Representative Ocasio-Cortez. And I also want to thank the members of the panel for their time and their interest and their dedication to this very important subject. And excuse me, I just came from the dentist, so I'm not sounding very well. The harm caused by urban peaker plants is still largely hidden from the public, and it's time to shed a light on the economic, environmental, and social injustices resulting from today's outdated, inefficient system of fossil fuel power for peak electricity demand. In 2019, an investigation by the Georgia Health News and WebMD uncovered that toxic levels of ethylene oxide were being spread into parts of Metro Atlanta, including the city of Covington, which is in my district. Despite the EPA's knowledge of the significant danger that ethylene oxide poses, the EPA failed to mitigate the release of the toxins or to notify communities of the potential toxicity in the air. Mr. Rogers Wright, as part of the Memorandum of Understanding, will peaker plants be required to report the levels of toxicity as a part of their agreement with the environmental justice groups? And will that information be made available to the public and to the citizens of the affected neighborhoods?
I can't really speak too much to the MOUs of the plants themselves, but what I can say, Congressman, is that Representative Clark and Senator Gillibrand's bill would absolutely require reporting from existing peaker plants so that we have all of this data. And that would also mirror the state level legislation that was introduced by State Senator Briscoe. So what I would say is that this information is critical to have because these toxins are invisible. I would also argue that under the Emergency and Planning and Community Right to Know Act, also known as EPRA, which includes the toxic release inventory, that this data should be readily available to the public. And if it's not, I would recommend that whether it's House Oversight or House Energy and Commerce to ask Administrator Michael Regan, why this is not the case. But this is very important that you brought this up. And once again, more of a reason why we must be sure that we keep a robust and functioning National Environmental Policy Act, which includes environmental review, so that we would have air quality emission analysis. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. We now recognize Mr. Sarbanes. And I say to the members, you must show your face before we can call on you. Okay, and he will be followed by Mr. Rocana, who I just saw, the chairman of the Environmental Committee. Mr. Sarbanes, then followed by Mr. Rocana. Thank you. You have to unmute Mr. Sarbanes. Does he have problems? Okay, we're going to Rocana. We seem to have some technical difficulties with you, Mr. Sarbanes. Representative Rocana, you must show yourself. Thank you. Good to see you. Wish you were here.
Good to see you.
Mr.
Thank you.
Chairman,
Thank you.
Thank you for supporting this effort. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Chair Maloney, and thank you for your incredible leadership on environmental justice issues. And you're having this field hearing. I really appreciate your making environment the top issue on the committee, one of the top issues. And I particularly am passionate about this issue with peakers, almost 1,000 of them across the United States. They disproportionately hurt Black and brown communities with extraordinary CO2 emissions, with sulfur emissions, with nitrous oxide emissions. We have one of them in my district in El Viso, and it's no coincidence that El Viso is one of the lowest income parts of my district. And I guess my question for Robert Wright or any of the panelists really is, what do you think President Biden's clean energy standard that is part of the Build Back Better bill that we will be passing in the House and Senate, what do you think that would do in preventing these peakers from hurting low-income communities? And if you could speak to what else we need to do to make sure that these peakers aren't hurting low-income Americans and Black and brown Americans.
Representative Khanna, thank you so much. It is very good to see you again, sir. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank you so much for your leadership in holding ExxonMobil accountable and bringing them in for some serious questions that United States needs answers to. Unfortunately, sir,
the chair deserves, I just want to make sure the chair deserves a lot of credit for that. Chair Maloney has been co-leading that effort with me. So thank you for that.
Yes, sir. Unfortunately, I would have to say that the clean energy standard, to say plainly, it needs to be cleaned up a bit. We cannot have any space for clean energy credits going to fracked gas units, or as Representative Ocasio-Cortez pointed out earlier, that are emitting methane. The same goes for biomass and also what we refer to, and I'm going to defer to my good colleague, Ms. Hernandez, in a moment to add on to this, false solutions like carbon capture sequestration and what I call Roy G. Biv hydrogen, whether it's green, blue, orange, yellow, whatever. Clean cannot be combustible. If it's combustible, then it is not clean. So I would say that with your leadership and your great staff, including Ms. Katie Thomas and Kevin Fox, we have to go a bit farther and build off of actually what, again, I'm lifting up Representative Clark and Representative Welsh offered, along with Indivisible. I think a very good alternative to a clean energy standard. But I think that Ms. Hernandez can definitely expand on that.
Thank you for that. I don't know if anyone else, if my time has expired. I would just say that we look forward to working with all of you on the reconciliation bill to make sure that the peakers issue is addressed to the best we can.
Thank you. We now recognize Mr. Sarbanes. You're now recognized. Please unmute. Mr. Sarbanes.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for the hearing, and very much appreciate the testimony of the witnesses that you've gathered. I also want to salute our colleague, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for her leadership. I love the Green New Deal. I love the powerful voices that have been assembled around that as a way of focusing us on what we need to do to catch up with a global climate change and try to get ahead of the curve. We know that we are battling left and right with many, many dire consequences. We also know that from time immemorial, those with power find a way to ship and shift their grime, their dirt, their pollution onto communities that do not have power, who lack the kind of voice that can push back. And what we're describing today is an example of that. But times are changing because with the voice of people like Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and others, political power is assembling in a different place, pushing back, bringing attention to things like these peaker plants and other issues that represent this broad environmental injustice that we've been seeing for decades in this country. If we can begin to flip the script here, I think we can do great things to lift up and empower communities that have often borne the brunt of this. And in the process, go figure, create jobs, reduce carbon emissions, and respect and celebrate and revere the blessings of our earth. So thank you for the hearing. The question I had for any of the witnesses who'd care to respond is on the issue of awareness within the communities that you serve and who are feeling this impact. Do you have a sense, it must be the case, this is true, given, as I said, some of the representation you now have in the places where power is assembled, but do you have a sense that the person on the street is more focused on these issues of environmental injustice and more prepared to take up arms in battling to address them than they were in previous years? And are you seeing an acceleration of that? And what does that look like? If you could speak to that, I'd love to hear it. Thank you. And I invite anybody who'd like to address that.
I'd be happy to address that question. It's not, it's not a secret to many organizers on the ground that even with the proposal of the speaker plan, that many organizers did not know about this until just a few months ago. I think that lately, because of representatives like Ocasio-Cortez, giving folks the empowerment to actually speak up and actually organize within their communities and not be afraid of these other bigger systems that do such a good job at quite literally bullying them and to think that they have no power. We see folks rising up and organizing more in their communities. However, all that organizers ask for, right, is to actually participate in the democratic process. We can't be part of the process and we can't work for it together if there's no transparency and there's no communication or dialogue being given to organizers on the ground, to people on the ground, and also quite clearly breaking down what is actually going on. I'm not afraid to say that this has actually been my first ever official professional hearing. And I'm an organizer. I'm a person that comes from organizing on the ground, and sometimes it can be very challenging with the lofty language and the really nitty-gritty of the policy. And we have to understand that we need to bring that back down to the community. We have to break it down. We actually have to explain to people and take the time and empower them to participate in this process too, and not just blame them for not coming out to vote or not participating in our hearings, right? I'm looking around here and quite literally majority staff. When we would have loved to see more folks from the community, but that is because we're not bringing it back down. That is why I love doing the work with these public housing organizers and around the Green New Deal for Public Housing, and why the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act is such a different piece of legislation than honestly any legislation that I've ever heard about, because it was actually created with the community side by side. The community was part of the draft, a really extensive drafting process where they were able to give their concerns, their vision, and what they wanted to see for their future, because it's their lives at the end of the day. And we're all just playing our roles in being able to push this forward in the halls of Congress. So we definitely need to do a better job at engaging our communities in this process, and in return, that will help empower them to actually work with us to create innovative solutions that are going to solve the crisis. Because believe it or not, the people that are living this day in and day out know the best, and we tend to forget that.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think my time has probably expired, but just to say, first of all, welcome to this forum. You've done an outstanding job, as have your fellow witnesses. And again, I want to thank the chairwoman and my colleague, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, for assembling an outstanding panel. But change is coming, because your voice and the voices of so many who represent communities that often have been marginalized is rising up and demanding a response on these issues of public policy that are affecting millions across the country. And I think this hearing today communicates that very powerfully. So with that, Madam Chair, I yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank you, and I thank all my colleagues for participating. As co-chairs, Representative Ocasio-Cortez and I were closed with 2 questions, one from me, one from her, and then we'll have an informal dialogue. I'd like to ask Ms. DeGarge. I absolutely adore the Green New Deal for public housing, and we do have 2 public housing chairs here who represent literally thousands of residents, and your points were taken. We had, limitations because of the COVID crisis that is emerging on how many people could attend. And we need to pass that bill. And we can pass that bill because we have a Democratic president, a Democratic Congress, and a Democratic Senate. And I'm very excited about fighting for the Green New Deal for public housing and fully funding public housing stock, along with Representative Ocasio-Cortez at the Financial Services Committee, where the legislation is on which we both serve. So I would just like to ask you, how did it come together and how was it written? Did it come from the community up? What role did residents play in that process?
Well, honestly, it started with the conversation. There's so many issues that plague public housing, and this is why public housing is such an intricate issue and to even tackle, because it's the intersection of so many different things: health, housing, economy, and because of that, there's just a million ways that you can go about it. But what kept coming up, right, was the inhumane conditions that these tenants are currently living in. Quite literally, they are facing a humanitarian crisis, and especially with the pandemic, that has just exacerbated those conditions, and they're living in apartments that are quite literally trying to kill them at this point. And so because of this mold, because of this lead, and also when you think about, if you look back and think about why public housing was even established in the first place, right? It was made to build the middle class. It was made to give opportunities. However, there's been a concerted effort to divest from public housing and stop investing in the people that live there. And so there's been this stagnant energy forever. And also because, again, unfortunately, powers that be do a really good job at making sure that public housing tenants feel like they have no power or that they have to align with the status quo. And so they've never been given the opportunity to actually come to have a seat at the table and express what their issues are and what the solutions they believe will be best for their lives. And that's the opportunity that Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's office and Senator Bernie Sanders' office gave these public housing tenants. And the conversation was very enlightening. We heard not only from the everyday struggles that the public housing tenants have to face living in public housing, the broken elevators, the mold, the lead, but we also heard about how they want more opportunities. They remember public housing being a community, being a beautiful community where people wanted to convene. They want to be able to participate in the rest of the community. But right now there's such a stigma with public housing developments. And they're quite literally gated off and closed off to the rest of the communities with these large big gates. And also in that process, in terms of the opportunities, we started talking about different programs that exist within public housing, like Section 3, like the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. These programs that public housing tenants did not know existed, that were there for their benefit. And so it empowered them to think, wow, if these are all the opportunities that are actually here for me, but there's been this concerted effort to divest from that and to divest from my future, we need to do something about this, and we need to create a bold solution. And on top of all of that, right, a lot of these public housing developments are on waterfronts, are next to these peeper plants, right? They are quite literally, when we define frontline communities, they are the front line. And so with the climate crisis just getting worse day by day, they knew that they needed to come up with a solution that is going to meet the scale of the crisis. And collectively, that's what happened. And that's how the Green New Deal for public housing specifically was brought about. And they participated in a drafting process, which again, you know, feedback from the public housing tenants, they've never been included in such a process. And sometimes you would even have to break it down and then explain how the drafting process is, what it is to write legislation, how a bill becomes a law even, right? And understanding that process. And through that, they were empowered to continue this work. And, you know, now it's grown, and we hope to have an impact enough to be able to pass it. But it really came down to giving people closest to the pain an opportunity to be close to the power and actually lead that change. And that's the difference. It all really comes down to the opportunity and empowering each other and supporting each other through that process.
Oversight Committee will be marking up the Justice 40 initiative and funding it. So we're thrilled about that. And the last question goes to Representative Ocasio-Cortez.
Thank you so much. You know, we've talked so much about the actual energy infrastructure, housing infrastructure. I'm thrilled that that's been the centerpiece of the discussion. I want us to talk a little bit about the health implications and the health landscape and how we really start moving forward and in tandem with developing solutions there. So I have a couple questions for Dr. Krieger. You know, as you've heard and as we've all heard throughout the course of this hearing, frontline communities are bearing just unconscionable health burdens. And in fact, my congressional district, our congressional district right here, along with Chair Maloney's and as well as Congressman Velasquez, Congressman Grace Meng, but New York 14 in particular, at the onset of the pandemic, was the #1 congressional district in the country for COVID cases at the outbreak of the pandemic. And it is no coincidence that this was the case, because for a lot of reasons, we have a lot of frontline workers, a lot of immigrant workers whose work cannot be remote, but also the severity of COVID when overlaid with the fact that these communities already have some of the highest rates of respiratory illness in the country due to things like peaker plants and other sorts of pollution, really created, just set up this crisis even further. And so one of the issues that we have here is that we don't measure this. And we do not measure air quality as a standard unit of infrastructure. So my question to you is if you could speak to the importance and how we, you know, any solutions or any proposals that you are aware of in why having these sensors are important, how we integrate air quality sensors as a standard kind of unit of infrastructure. And also if you know of any other types of sensors or standard measurements that we should be keeping track of that aren't currently measured, at least at the scale that they potentially should be.
Thank you. So, you know, this hits on, I think, a really important point, is that we have a shortage of data on, honestly, air pollutant concentrations, soil pollutant concentrations, and environmental health metrics across the board. One of the projects that my organization actually has right now in Richmond, California, one of the most disadvantaged communities in our state, home to a refinery, numerous highways, and multiple industrial sources, is a low-cost air quality monitoring project with nitrogen oxide, ozone, particulate matter, and black carbon monitors. Historically, there has been a single EPA regulatory monitor in this area. We're now have 50 monitors out to identify hotspots, to figure out where we need to concentrate on reducing industrial emissions, where we can actually electrify heavy duty transportation, trucks, buses, in order to reduce those emissions in some of the most overburdened areas. So I think that the technology for these like low-cost monitors has been improving rapidly in the last few years. And we're starting to be at the point where we can deploy these across the board. There's also technologies that can be attached to cars. So you can drive through streets and try to figure out which blocks have the highest concentrations of particulate matter, diesel particulate matter, and so forth. And until we do that, we cannot really verifiably reduce those emission reductions. And as we move forward, I think it is critically important that we increase not only that air monitoring, but make sure that it is reported, that it is accessible, that populations across the country have access to it, and can then hold polluters basically accountable to verifying that those emission reductions are occurring.
Thank you. There's so much we could discuss on this important topic all day, but unfortunately our time has come to an end. And I will be leaving this discussion and going to testify at another meeting. I just want to end by saying there are 5 peakers within 2 blocks of Queensbridge. There are 24 right here in Astoria and Long Island City. And there are 10 peaker units within 1 mile of where we're sitting right now, and 28 in the vicinity of my district. This is just polluting and plain wrong. And it seems that the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation is ignoring the reality that we live in here in this community. We do not need an additional new peaker in my colleague's district. And I will be joining her at 1 o'clock, testifying in deep opposition to this fracked gas proposal in her district. I hope all of you will join us and go and testify against it and really come up with ideas of how we can stop it. Because although it's in her district, it will be polluting and causing disease in my district and other districts. It's insanity to add another peaker plant to where there are already 28. It's talk about environmental justice. There is nothing more important. As Mrs. Koger said so beautifully earlier at our meeting, I came to this community, the air was clean. Now my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren have asthma because of the peakers. We cannot allow this to happen. I thank all of you for coming. I particularly thank my colleague who's an inspiration with her very strong focus on the environment. She's brought a lot of energy and excitement to Congress. I thank her for joining me, for working on this. And I think we should all join her in stopping yet another peaker in our community. We will carry this battle to Congress. We will battle to pass legislation, but we have a battle right now, right in front of us, and that's to stop yet another life-threatening, polluting peaker plant. Believe me, 28 in this vicinity is enough. There are a lot of miles across this country. You don't need to put all of the 29th one right here in this community where people are suffering and literally dying from the pollution. I thank the staff for coming here. I thank all of the panelists, many of whom have dedicated their lives to this fight, and we will continue it, and I yield back. By the way, you have 5 days to put materials into the official congressional hearing record, which will be part of the history of our fight to end the peakers. Thank you.